What happens when a Hollywood powerhouse decides he's done playing nice with a talk show host used to trampling over everyone? The result is pure unadulterated chaos. Joy Behar thought she could manipulate and corner Gary Oldman using her signature ambush tactics, completely blind to the fact that she was walking straight into a buzzsaw. What was supposed to be a standard celebrity appearance rapidly degenerated into one of the most explosive, jaw-dropping meltdowns daytime television has ever witnessed. By the time the cameras cut away, Joy would do the unthinkable, storming off her very own set in a blind rage, leaving the entire studio audience dead silent, and her co-hosts desperately scrambling to save the broadcast from total disaster. The studio was practically vibrating with the usual high-stakes energy that morning, with producers frantically whispering last-minute adjustments, while the glam squad rushed to finish touch-ups. Tucked away in the green room, Gary Oldman was preparing to step out for the second segment to promote his raw new political thriller. It should have been a paint-by-numbers promotional spot, the kind of easy publicity actors do in their sleep. But behind the scenes, a completely different script was being written. Joy Behar sat in her usual perch at the famous round table, sipping her coffee with an intensely focused look on her face, already gripping a list of weaponized questions she couldn't wait to unleash. She believed she had found the ultimate silver bullet to blindside her guest. While the rest of the world wanted to talk about Oldman's legendary decades-long career of chameleonic acting, Joy had zeroed in on a completely unrelated target. Deep in the archives, she had unearthed a handful of controversial off-the-cuff remarks he had made to a British publication months prior regarding the American political landscape, and she was fully prepared to use them as bait. The studio lights flared back to life as the countdown clock hit 0, and Whoopi Goldberg delivered a flawless, practiced introduction to transition the show back from commercial. Gary Oldman stepped onto the stage, radiating a calm, effortless confidence, offering a polite wave to the roaring crowd before settling into his chair. The energy in the room was electric, filled with the profound respect reserved only for cinema royalty. Whoopi welcomed him warmly as the cheers faded, expressing how thrilled they all were to discuss his latest cinematic masterpiece. Oldman, ever the gentleman, offered a gracious smile and a soft-spoken thank you in his distinct British accent. On the surface, the interview started out completely normal, but the shocking part was how quickly the trap was about to spring. Whoopi kicked things off by asking about his deep immersion into the character, and Oldman captivated the room, speaking with profound eloquence about his meticulous research, the real-world figures he met, and why cinema has a duty to expose the raw truth about power and systemic corruption. The rest of the panel leaned in, throwing out intelligent, engaging questions about his artistic process and how the film reflected the chaotic world outside the studio walls. It was a masterclass in celebrity interviewing. But just as the conversation hit a smooth, comfortable rhythm, Joy Behar shifted her weight and leaned forward. And regular viewers knew that specific predatory look in her eye meant a storm was about to hit. She interjected with a sharp tone that instantly felt more like a courtroom interrogation than a daytime talk show, demanding to pivot away from the film to address something far more volatile. Joy confidently asserted that a few months prior, Oldman had made comments about American voters that she found deeply troubling, accusing him of suggesting that the public is essentially clueless about the very issues they vote on. In an instant, the cheerful energy in the room evaporated, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the entire studio. Oldman didn't flinch. His face remained a mask of pure composure, but if you looked closely, you could see a dangerous tightening around his eyes as he calmly asked her to clarify exactly what statement she was twisting. With an air of triumph, Joy produced a printed sheet of paper she'd been hiding, completely ready for a fight, and read aloud a quote where Oldman claimed American political discourse had become so radically polarized that emotions had completely replaced facts at the ballot box. She smugly threw it in his face, labeling the sentiment elite and condescending. Oldman let the accusation hang in the air for a calculated beat, completely unbothered, before striking back with ice-cold precision. He fired back that if she was going to weaponize his words, she had an obligation to provide the full context, explaining that the original discussion was actually about how artists must handle complex societal issues with nuance, rather than making lazy, sweeping judgments about the public. But instead of backing down, Joy smelled blood and doubled down, her voice rising in pitch as she aggressively pressed him, demanding he admit to the words on the page. Oldman's voice stayed deadly calm, but a razor-sharp edge crept into his delivery as he looked her dead in the eye, stating he wasn't denying a single thing. Instead, he boldly pointed out that ripping a tiny fragment from a deeply nuanced conversation to create cheap sensationalism was the exact type of toxic behavior causing the societal divide she was pretending to be worried about. The air in the studio turned to ice. The other co-hosts frantically exchanged panicked glances, completely paralyzed and torn between throwing a lifeline to a drowning segment or just staying out of the line of fire. But what happened next changed everything. The entire audience could feel the shift in the room as the atmosphere reached a boiling point, realizing they were no longer watching a routine interview, but a high-stakes psychological war. Joy, completely blinded by her own agenda, refused to back down, aggressively escalating the attack by throwing his nationality in his face. She bluntly told him that as a guest in America who makes his millions off the public going overseas to criticize how citizens think and vote was the definition of hypocrisy. And this is where things got interesting. Gary Oldman's polite Hollywood demeanor instantly evaporated, replaced by an ice-cold steel-nerved seriousness that signaled he was done playing nice. He repeated her words back to her with chilling slowness, letting the sheer absurdity of the accusation hang in the air. He fired back that he had paid more in American taxes than most people would ever see in a lifetime, having built his entire life, raised his children, and poured into communities across the country. With absolute authority, he made it clear that reducing him to an unentitled outsider just because of his British accent wasn't just completely inaccurate, it was deeply insulting. A wave of stunned murmurs rippled through the crowd, with many visibly uncomfortable at how personal and nasty the attack had become, while others leaned forward, hooked on the unfolding drama. But instead of reading the room and pulling back, Joy let her ego take the wheel and doubled down on her trap. She tried to mask her aggression by claiming she wasn't saying he wasn't welcome, but smugly suggested he should show a little more gratitude to the American public, who handed him his massive success rather than judging them from afar. The words seemed to hang in the air like a weapon. Oldman's voice didn't rise, but it carried a terrifying weight as he looked her dead in the eye and told her that real gratitude does not demand blind silence. In a masterclass of composure, he argued that truly caring about a nation and its people means having the courage to ask the difficult questions and initiate the uncomfortable conversations that lazy media avoids. Sensing a total train wreck, Whoopi desperately tried to throw out a lifeline, frantically attempting to steer the conversation back to the movie before things went completely off the rails. But Joy was too far gone, entirely convinced she had successfully engineered a viral, morally superior moment. She scoffed, telling him his explanation was just a fancy way of hiding the fact that he thought American voters were simply too stupid to understand their own country. That was the exact moment the trap snapped shut on Joy herself. Gary Oldman slowly set down his water glass, completely locking eyes with her, and when he finally spoke, his quiet, lethal precision echoed into every corner of the silent studio. He calmly stated that across his decades-long career he had handled aggressive, hostile, and deeply provocative journalists. But what she was doing wasn't journalism, and it wasn't even good television. He exposed her right then and there, calling out her cheap tactics of stripping an intellectual conversation about media manipulation and turning it into a weapon just to ambush a guest for clicks. He didn't stop there. He delivered the final crushing blow, looking directly at her and stating that if anyone on that stage was actually looking down on people, it was her, insulting her own audience by assuming they were completely incapable of handling a mature, nuanced conversation. The silence that slammed into the room after that lethal rebuke was absolutely deafening. Joy Behar's face instantly flushed a deep crimson, her heavy television makeup doing absolutely nothing to hide the pure rage bubbling right under her skin. She was completely unaccustomed to being dismantled so elegantly, so thoroughly, and certainly not on the very set she claimed to rule. Her voice cracked under the immense pressure as she desperately tried to claw back her dignity, stammering out an accusation that he was just being overly dramatic and that she was simply asking standard tough questions. Oldman merely leaned back in his chair, his body language entirely relaxed, but his intense gaze remaining firmly locked onto hers. He repeated the word with a cool, mocking calm. He laid out the facts like a seasoned prosecutor, pointing out that she had questioned his right to work in the country, labeled him an ungrateful foreign outsider, and deliberately twisted his words to engineer a toxic controversy out of thin air. He looked at her and coldly stated that if that was her definition of standard journalism, then they operated on two entirely different planets. The rest of the panel looked like they wanted to vanish into thin air, utterly becalmed, horrified by the unfolding disaster. But Joy's legendary explosive temper was now completely unshackled, and she snapped viciously at her co-host to stay out of it, claiming she could fight her own battles. She turned her fury back to Oldman, aggressively shouting that he clearly just couldn't handle everyday Americans having an opinion on his statements, snidely asking if that exact type of Hollywood elitism wasn't what the entire country was sick and tired of. A subtle, dangerous smile crept onto Oldman's face, showing a hint of genuine amusement for the very first time. He flipped the entire accusation right back on her with absolute mastery. He calmly asked how she could preach about elitism while sitting on a powerful national platform, constantly interrupting her guest, weaponizing fake quotes, and then throwing a tantrum when he defended himself. He suggested that if she truly wanted to see what an elitist looked like, she needed to go find a mirror. A collective audible gasp ripped through the studio audience, followed by a wave of undeniable murmurs of agreement. Joy's face turned from a deep red to a volatile purple as she hissed under her breath, demanding to know how he dared to walk onto her stage and lecture her on professionalism. She bragged about her decades on the air, but Oldman shut her down with a single sentence, quietly observing that decades of experience clearly hadn't translated into an ounce of wisdom or professionalism. That was the absolute breaking point. Joy violently hurled herself out of her chair with such force that it rolled back several feet across the stage, screaming that she refused to sit there and be insulted by someone who thought a British accent made them superior. Whoopi desperately lunged into the fray to regain control, but Joy was completely past the point of no return, totally blinded by a toxic mix of ego and rage. She fiercely brushed her co-host off, screaming that this was the exact disease-rotting Hollywood and the media elite, accusing high-profile stars of bleeding American audiences dry for millions only to turn around and look down their noses at the public. Throughout the entire unhinged tirade, Gary Oldman didn't even flinch. He remained completely relaxed, hands folded neatly in his lap like a man watching a minor inconvenience play out. With an impossibly steady voice, he looked up and pointed out that he had never once suggested anyone was beneath him. Instead, he calmly observed that he had merely called out her utter lack of professionalism, and her current hysterical meltdown was proving his point with spectacular precision. The words seemed to push her over the edge, her voice escalating into a literal shriek as she threw the accusation back in his face. She venomously claimed that real unprofessionalism was a celebrity walking onto her set acting far too superior to answer a direct question. Oldman didn't even have to raise his voice to dismantle her argument, instantly firing back that he had seamlessly answered every single question thrown his way. The only thing he refused to do was sit back and allow her to aggressively twist his words and assassinate his character without a fight, coolly suggesting that if his boundary made her uncomfortable, the flaw lay with her, not his answers. Sensing a total unmitigated disaster on live television, Sarah Haynes leaped into the line of fire, frantically gesturing to the crew and pleading to cut to a commercial break. But Joy spun on her heel, fiercely barking at her own colleague that there would be absolutely no breaks, demanding the cameras stay rolling so the entire world could witness what she believed was the true ugly face of Hollywood elitism. And this is where things took a cinematic turn. Gary Oldman slowly rose to his feet, his commanding presence completely dominating the stage and instantly making Joy's erratic theatrics look incredibly small and unhinged by comparison. He looked down at her, his voice slicing through her chaotic shouting like a razor-sharp blade. He told her that he had spent his entire life studying human psychology and understanding the deep-rooted insecurities that drive human behavior, and right now he noted he was looking at an incredibly desperate individual. Someone so utterly terrified of being challenged that she was willing to completely humiliate herself and her colleagues on live national television rather than simply admit she made a mistake. Joy's face contorted into pure madness as she screamed back that she hadn't made a single error, shrieking that the only mistake was booking him on the show to begin with. Oldman merely offered a quiet, devastating nod of agreement, murmuring that she might be right, but absolutely not for the reasons she thought. That cold, effortless comeback completely shattered whatever restraint Joy had left. Spinning toward the dark edges of the set, she began frantically screaming at the off-camera producers, wildly pointing her finger at the legendary actor and demanding they drag him off her stage like a common criminal. But what happened next left the entire control room completely paralyzed. Joy issued a fierce final ultimatum that shocked the entire control room, boldly declaring that she was completely done and that either he was getting kicked out of the studio or she was walking out. Whoopi quickly rose from her chair, desperately trying to inject a shred of sanity back into the broadcast by pleading with her to take a breath, but Joy whirled on her longtime colleague like a cornered animal. She fiercely barked at Whoopi to stop, telling her to calm down, wildly accusing her of switching sides and demanding to know if the entire panel was just going to sit back and allow a guest to completely disrespect her on her own turf. Sensing that the situation had degenerated into a total circus, Gary Oldman turned away from the shouting and quietly informed a nearby producer that it was probably best if he exited the stage, as the conversation had clearly ceased to be productive for anyone involved. Joy let out a bitter, mocking laugh, instantly weaponizing his grace by accusing him of playing the victim. She taunted him to run away, sneering that he should hurry back to his British inner circle to spin a dramatic story about how terribly he was treated by the American public. Oldman stopped dead in his tracks while gathering his things, turning around to lock eyes with her one final time. He delivered an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare, calmly observing that he had walked onto that set to discuss a cinematic piece about deep-rooted corruption and the toxic abuse of power, but had no idea he would be treated to such a vivid real-time demonstration of both. That final lethal truth completely shattered Joy's remaining sanity. She exploded into a screeching frenzy, wildly screaming at him to get out as her voice echoed violently through the rafters of the studio. In a desperate, unhinged power move, she began frantically calling for security to physically drag him out of the building. The utter absurdity of demanding armed guards to remove an elite peaceful Hollywood legend simply because he defended himself against a smear campaign wasn't lost on a single person in the room. A massive wave of boos suddenly erupted from the studio audience, creating an intense wall of sound as viewers revolted against the blatant disrespect unfolding before their eyes. Gary Oldman remained the epitome of class, walking calmly toward the wings of the stage, pausing only to offer a warm handshake to Whoopi and the remaining co-hosts, while completely erasing Joy's continued screaming from his awareness. Even as the legendary actor vanished through the backstage curtain, Joy refused to shut down, continuing to shout into her live microphone about a total lack of respect for the people who built the television industry. Ana Navarro, who had wisely remained completely silent throughout the entire explosive firefight, finally attempted to break the tension, softly suggesting that perhaps Joy needed to take a step back. But Joy spun around to face her like a whirlwind, her hair visibly disheveled from her own tantrum, and her makeup smeared under the intense studio lights. She fiercely cut her off, demanding to know if she was expected to apologize for standing up to someone she believed felt superior to regular people. The entire set was an absolute unprecedented chaos. The audience was a hive of confused, buzzing chatter. The remaining co-hosts were staring at each other in total bewilderment, and the executive producers were sweating through their clothes, trying to figure out how to salvage the wreckage of the live broadcast. That's when Whoopi Goldberg slowly stepped forward, her body language radiating the heavy, unshakable authority of an industry veteran who had navigated countless media crises, prepared to take the reins before the network pulled the plug entirely. Whoopi stepped in with absolute gravity, bluntly reminding her that they had a stadium full of people watching and live cameras rolling that required them to pull the broadcast back together. But Joy was completely checked out, utterly indifferent to the network, the audience, or the catastrophic damage being done to her professional legacy. Her chest heaved rapidly, her hands trembling with a volatile mix of adrenaline and fury, as she glared at the empty chair where Gary Oldman had masterfully dismantled her just moments prior. Then her voice suddenly dropped from a frantic shriek to an eerie, hollow whisper that sent a visible chill through the entire studio. She murmured that she was completely done, refusing to sit there and play pretend, as if the total destruction of her authority was just business as usual. Sarah Haynes carefully took a step forward, raising her hands in a peaceful gesture and softly begging her to just pause and breathe. But Joy instantly threw up a wall. She snapped at her to back off and stop trying to manage her like a child, stating she knew exactly what was running through everyone's minds, that everyone on that stage believed she had crossed a line and gone way too far. A suffocating silence slammed back into the room, broken only by the uneasy, anxious whispering of the crowd. The red recording lights remained bright, capturing every single second of what was rapidly cementing itself as the most spectacular psychological collapse in modern broadcasting history. Ana Navarro cleared her throat with extreme caution, delicately suggesting that perhaps this incredibly raw conversation was better suited for the privacy of the dressing rooms. Joy let out a dry, venomous laugh that rattled through the microphones. She fired back that there was absolutely nothing private about a live national broadcast, bitterly pointing out that millions of people had just watched a guest completely strip away her dignity on her own set, and declaring there was simply no coming back from a defeat that absolute. Sunny Hostin tried to soften the blow, gently interjecting that she hadn't been humiliated at all, but had merely gotten caught up in a passionate debate that spun slightly out of control. That completely missed the mark. Joy's voice spiked right back into hysteria as she screamed that the man hadn't just debated her, he had branded her an absolute amateur in front of the entire country and told the world she was utterly incompetent at her job. And then she dropped a psychological bomb that left the entire room paralyzed, quietly admitting that maybe, just maybe, the legendary actor was completely right. The confession hung in the thick air like a live grenade. The panel exchanged deeply worried glances as Whoopi closed the distance between them, using the ultra-calm, grounded tone she reserved for absolute emergencies. She tried to reassure her that decades of brilliant television couldn't be erased by one disastrous segment, but Joy's eyes were completely wild now, darting frantically between the faces of her colleagues and the judging gaze of the audience as she whispered that she was standing there, realizing she couldn't even remember why she had started the fight in the first place, or what ego-driven point she was so desperately trying to prove. She laid her soul completely bare on live television, openly questioning if her entire goal had just been to bully a brilliant mind into submission, or to humiliate an icon simply because she couldn't handle an intellectual perspective from a completely different context. The sheer unvarnished vulnerability of the confession was absolutely staggering. Joy Behar, a woman who had built an entire empire on having a razor-sharp tongue and a quick-witted defense for everything, was completely disintegrating in front of millions of people. Her voice fractured as she admitted she had devolved into the exact media monster she used to despise, the kind of talk show host who attacks public figures for sport, distorts reality to fabricate cheap drama, and values winning a toxic argument far more than finding the truth. The studio audience sat frozen in a heavy, breathless silence, fully aware they were watching a historic, unprecedented piece of television history. Even the most cynical viewers had never witnessed a daytime host break character so completely. Joy suddenly locked eyes directly with the main studio camera, her hair entirely disheveled and her heavy makeup streaked with tears, yet her gaze carried a sudden piercing clarity. She looked right into the lens and confessed that Gary Oldman was entirely accurate in his assessment, flatly admitting to being an amateur who maliciously twisted his words just because she assumed her status made her untouchable. She paused to catch a shuddering breath, stating that she could no longer live with the hypocrisy. Whoopi gently reached out to comfort her, but Joy immediately stepped back, refusing to be handled. She coldly declared that she was completely finished with the broadcast, with her famous seat at the round table, and with the daily charade of pretending their segments were anything more than weaponized gossip and highly manufactured outrage. Anna frantically tried to intervene, begging her to step into the wings for just a few minutes to clear her head, but Joy stood her ground, unhooking her audio equipment. She noted that no amount of backstage damage control could erase the reality of what had just occurred, or the fact that she had spent an entire segment trying to assassinate a man's character out of pure intellectual laziness. She detached the wireless transmitter from her waistline and placed it firmly on the glass table with a heavy final click that echoed through the sound system. Turning to her panel of co-hosts, she addressed them with a chilling formal gravity that felt undeniably like a permanent farewell, stating it had been an honor to share the stage, but she could no longer occupy that chair, knowing she had become the kind of person who punishes intelligence. Sunny Hostin instantly leaped to her feet as the gravity of the situation set in. Sunny pleaded with her to sit down and reconsider, desperately warning her that she was throwing away a legendary career based on a single emotionally charged moment. But Joy merely looked back at her with a profound, unshakable serenity that left the entire room unsettled. For the first time since the cameras started rolling that morning, the frantic panic had completely vanished from her eyes. She softly observed that rather than a reckless mistake, this actually felt like the most rational, clear-headed choice she had made in a very long time. She turned her entire body to face the studio audience, where people were already standing up in their seats, completely bewildered and utterly unsure of how to process the historic breakdown happening right in front of them. She looked directly at the crowd and delivered a direct apology to every single viewer who had supported her over the decades, candidly stating that the public deserved far better than the cheap ambush they had just witnessed. She noted that an audience deserves a host capable of facilitating an intelligent, mature dialogue with a global icon without devolving into a petty personal vendetta. With that final confession, she grabbed her purse from the floor and began walking toward the exit. Whoopi's voice echoed through the studio speakers one last time, frantically shouting her name and begging her to wait, but Joy never broke her stride. She refused to look back at the cameras, the lights, or the panel. She walked off the set with the absolute certainty that had defined her entire life in show business. Except this time she was permanently walking away from the very empire she helped build. The live feed remained active, capturing the remaining co-hosts, frozen in a state of absolute paralyzed shock, staring blankly at her vacant seat, as if expecting her to walk back out. Finally pulling on the legendary composure that had carried her through a lifetime in the spotlight, Whoopi looked directly into the lens and quietly announced they would be heading straight to a commercial break. The screen instantly cut to black, but every single person watching at home knew that daytime television had just changed forever. Joy Behar had walked away from her life's work on a live broadcast, undone not by an external scandal or a network corporate decision, but by a sudden devastating flash of self-awareness, triggered by an elite actor who simply refused to be intimidated. That image of the vacant chair at the famous round table would instantly go viral, embedding itself into pop culture history as a powerful testament to what happens when the mirror is held up too close. It leaves us with a fascinating question. Did Gary Oldman handle the situation perfectly by defending his integrity, or should he have just smiled and played the standard Hollywood publicity game?